My topic is Martha Strayer, Intrepid reporter. Largely forgotten in the 21st century, she was a bit of a legend in the 20th century. She broke through barriers. She cracked glass ceilings before the term was even invented. And she dared to defy at numerous points in her long career. My purpose this morning is to introduce a 21st century audience to this very special journalist. Miss Strayer was born in 1889 in Steubenville, Ohio. She was one of 8 children, 6 girls and 2 boys. Her dad was a farmer. The entire family valued education. She loved learning. She went through the Steubenville, Ohio schools and obtained credentials to be a teacher. In those days, opportunities for women were very limited, and she chose teaching. She enjoyed the classroom and thrived, but she was restricted by the rules of Ohio education authorities, and she felt that she could have a greater impact elsewhere. So she took a job with she left the classroom and took a job with the Steubenville Gazette. And there she was assigned, as women were in those days, to the society pages. But it was at the Steubenville Gazette that she honed her writing skills and her reporting skills. In her late 20s, she made the decision to move to Washington, D.C. It's a mystery what drew her there. My research suggests that it may have been an older sibling who moved there first. In any event, she moved in 1920, and in 1921 obtained a job with the Washington Daily News. That year, there was a violent snowstorm in Washington, D.C. Ice and snow buildup caused the collapse of a roof of a commercial building. And Miss Strayer walked 25 blocks in 5-foot snow drifts. And yes, this was Washington, D.C., not Syracuse, New York, to cover the story and get the scoop. She did. Her credentials were firmly established. She was assigned various beats in those days. She did the criminal justice system. She did the courts, the crime news. She did politics. She did municipal meetings at every level. She covered the Daughters of the American Revolution, an organization of women that had been founded in 1890. And she became known as a front page girl because she was one of the few women journalists whose byline could be found on the front page. Now, in those days, the National Press Club excluded women. So the few women that were involved in journalism, and most of them wrote for the society pages in those days, formed the National Women's Press Club. Miss Strayer joined that and became its president in 1931. Where she served capably. In 1932, Franklin Roosevelt was elected president and inaugurated in March of 1933. Soon after that, his wife Eleanor began the custom of holding press conferences. Now, this was unprecedented. And on the screen behind me, the photo was taken actually in the 1940s. This was a reunion of the women who attended the first press conference in early 1933. Miss Strayer is the second woman on the right, and of course, Mrs. Roosevelt is the lady roughly in the middle there, the tallest lady in the middle. The others are journalists from various publications at the time. Mrs. Roosevelt did something very unusual. Only women journalists were allowed to come to her press conferences. The rationale was that in the depths of the Great Depression, it would be very easy to lay off the women from their jobs. This was a way to keep them employed. She would go on to hold 350 press conferences during the 12 years of her husband's presidency, and Miss Strayer covered the vast majority of them. Early in the Roosevelt administration, an announcement had to be made about serving alcohol in the White House. Well, Mr. Roosevelt's advisors thought that this would be an ideal announcement for Mrs. Roosevelt to make, seeing as how she was a known teetotaler. Mrs. Roosevelt consulted with Miss Strayer, also a teetotaler, and they worked up a strategy whereas the announcement would be made under the best possible circumstances. Beer would be served at the White House with the idea that it would promote temperance because folks would stay away from hard liquor. It would be another 9 months before wine would be served at the White House. Along with attending the weekly press conferences, Miss Strayer covered the crime beat. In covering the crime beat, she came across the story of Charles Bernstein. Charles Bernstein was a bit of a character. Bad luck followed him wherever he went. He was one of those guys that was always in the wrong place at the wrong time. In Minnesota, as a young man, he was arrested for robbery, convicted of that robbery, and sent to prison for 8 years. He was an innocent man. He didn't commit the robbery. After he received a full pardon and moved to Washington, D.C., his criminal record and his prison record followed him, but not his pardon. At that time, a drug kingpin was sitting in his car on the streets of Washington, D.C., and was shot in cold blood. The police rounded up a number of potential suspects, including Mr. Bernstein. Now, Mr. Bernstein had an alibi, but it didn't hold up in court because there was an eyewitness who testified that he saw him pull the trigger and commit the murder. Well, Miss Strayer got a hold of the story. She covered the story as part of her crime beat, and she recognized that things were not adding up. So she began a series of investigative reporting. That's what we would call it today, although they didn't use that term back then. And she actually paid a visit to the eyewitness. And she visited the eyewitness at his apartment. And they were chatting about the case, and she looked out the window and saw a large tree filled with leaves. The crime had taken place during the summertime. She realized that there was no way that this man could have seen the face of the killer from the second floor apartment 70 feet away through the leaves of this tree. So the story received a lot of attention. Miss Strayer dared to defy the criminal justice system. Phone calls were made. Mrs. Roosevelt got in on the story. A phone call was made to her husband, and Mr. Roosevelt issued a reprieve minutes before the execution was to take place. Yes, in those days, Washington, D.C. had capital punishment, including the electric chair. Mr. Bernstein was spared. More on him in just a moment. In 1939, Marian Anderson, the renowned African-American singer, was touring the United States. Her managers wanted to arrange for a venue in Washington, D.C. for a concert for her to perform. The only concert hall large enough to hold the expected audience was Constitution Hall. This was owned by the Daughters of the American Revolution. They, despite several dates that were suggested, they would not allow her to perform at their hall because of her race. Once again, Miss Strayer covered the DAR as part of her regular beat. Mrs. Roosevelt, a member of the DAR, resigned in protest. The story took on a life of its own. The president directed his Secretary of Interior to make arrangements for Miss Anderson to perform at the Lincoln Memorial, which she did. And on April 9th, 1939, she performed before a crowd of 75,000 people. The dress that she wore that day is prominently displayed at the African American Museum that has just opened in Washington, D.C. this past month. Miss Strayer was on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial during the performance. In the late 1940s, NBC Radio produced a program called The Big Story. It was used to honor journalists whose writings and reportings had made an impact and made a difference in their communities. Most of the recipients of the honor were men, but in the late 1940s, they chose Martha Strayer to be honored with The Big Story. And the case of Charles Bernstein, which she had investigated, and he was eventually exonerated and eventually pardoned, became the subject of The Big Story. It was dramatized on radio in the 1940s. The scriptwriter was Gail Ingram, who went on to write scripts for The Millionaire and My Three Sons during the golden age of television. 4 years later, The Big Story was produced on television, and Miss Strayer enjoyed a bit of fame at that time. In the 1950s, she decided to write a book about the Daughters of the American Revolution. She had covered them for the better part of 3 decades. She went to the officials and asked to use their archives. She was denied. They would not allow her to use their archives to write a history. She dared to defy them. She went to her own notes, her own interviews, and researched at the Library of Congress and published the book in 1958. Today, we would call it an unauthorized history. Back in those days, she called it an informal history of the Daughters of the American Revolution. During the 1930s, Mrs. Roosevelt offered her a job with the New Deal, with the National Recovery Administration. She turned it down. She thought it would be a conflict of interest. She covered the Board of Education for the Washington, D.C. municipality for the better part of 4 decades. Her coverage was so thorough and so meticulous that at one point she was in the hospital. She dared to defy even her health. The Board of Education actually met in her hospital room so that she wouldn't miss a meeting and could cover that meeting. In 1961, after 4 decades of reporting for the Washington Daily News, Miss Strayer retired. But she planned in retirement to write a biography of Mrs. Roosevelt. Unfortunately, illness and death precluded that possibility. What is her legacy? Miss Strayer's papers, professional and personal, were donated to the University of Wyoming, and researchers there can examine them for research into journalism during this time period. Her book is out of print now, of course. When I looked at Amazon.com a week or so ago, there were 2 copies available at $498 each. When I looked last night, no copies of the book are available. But I think the greatest legacy that Miss Strayer has left us is for young men and young women alike, a legacy of perseverance, a legacy of integrity, a legacy of tenacity, a legacy of a willingness to dare to defy. On a final note, you may wonder, what in the world got this guy so interested in Miss Strayer? Well, she was my grandmother's sister. I called her Aunt Martha. And I had met her a few times, but what I remember most is, under the encouragement of my grandmother, I would write her letters to practice my penmanship. She was still working at the time, but she always responded. And I remember that crisp, clear, newspaper reporter style that was so effective. Others may remember a legend. a breaker of barriers, a cracker of the glass ceilings, but I remember a lady of extraordinary grace and kindness. Thank you.